We are going to talk about science fiction and innovation.
Yep.
Something that you cover in your book, Awakening the Warrior, by Richard Charles Lawrence, available on Amazon.
Nice.
Shameless plug. Go for it. Give us a bit of an overview about what you cover in the book in this respect, and why it's important.
Yeah. There's one thing that I think is quite important, is that although we tend to call it science fiction, Robert Heinlein called it speculative fiction, just because it takes in a much wider genre than just what we think of as science fiction. So Robert Heinlein, yeah. So Robert Heinlein being one of the sort of foremost American writers of science fiction.
Okay.
You'll be aware probably of quite a few of his books,
right.
Like Starship Troopers, for example, which
okay.
we'll probably talk about during this. But one of the keys to it is the fact that I never used to read novels at all, like when I was younger, because I just didn't think that I had time for them.
Yeah.
And then when I was in the army, I started to read science fiction novels or speculative fiction novels, and I sort of never stopped since. And what I think is so useful about them is that it's really the literature of ideas. And so what science fiction writers do, or good science fiction writers, is they make you think in different ways that you'd never considered. And in a good science fiction book by a good writer, there's probably more creative expression and crazy ideas in there that make you think about different possibilities than in almost anything else. The same is true of in movies as well. Mm-hmm. And that's why I think that all people that are interested in problem solving, innovation, should really get into things like science fiction novels. Not just because they're entertaining, often they really are, but because there's so much in them that will make you think of things in a new perspective.
Yeah, right, okay, so perspective change and stuff, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so just by reading that kind of thing, it opens your mind and kind of switches you on to different ways of thinking, I suppose, thinking outside the box, all that kind of...
Yeah, I mean, if you're already a thoughtful person,
yeah.
And you do think about how to solve problems, and if you're a creative person as well,
right.
It's going to make you think in a lot of different ways. And when you read it and digest it, there's so many sort of surprises in science fiction, whether it's from a kind of hard science fiction point of view, like an Arthur C. Clarke or someone like that, which will use scientific principles and then play with them and take them to areas where it is speculative.
Yeah.
So you're guessing, but you're going what if all the time. So if you're thinking about how to create contingency plans and things, you need to consider all the factors of a problem, the secondary, tertiary effects, then it'll take you to a new place in your thinking if you're going to read some of these books.
Are there any particular books that spring to mind that you think would be good for people if they're on board with this idea?
Well,
they should turn to?
There are, but one of the things that kind of, I guess you're a big fan of Ready Player One.
Love that book. As
I am.
Yeah.
What did you like about it? I mean, that's maybe where we should start off.
Yeah, I guess for me, well, I don't do as much reading as you do when it comes to sci-fi stuff, but Ready Player One, the images that book conjured up in my mind and the kind of the landscapes and the things that I envisaged in my mind from reading it was bonkers. And I thought they did a really good job with the film, because we went to watch the film, right?
We did.
I thought the film... I mean, it wasn't as close to the book as often is the case, I suppose.
Yeah, it's got to be cinematic.
It was fairly close to the kind of the pictures that I put in my mind. But I always think with this sort of stuff, anything like this, War of the Worlds is a good example. I remember listening to that loads when I was a kid. And I used to go on holiday. We used to listen to that in the car and stuff. It kept us quiet for hours. And the images that you conjure up in your mind are always better than the images that actually come out on the screen.
Yeah.
So I thought they did a cracking job in the film particularly, but the book was that Ernest Cline's a genius, I think.
Well, War of the Worlds is a good example, I think, because, like, spoiler alert if you haven't read War of the Worlds, I mean, you should have done because it's like from the Victorian era, but the idea that H.G. Wells had of the Martians being killed by a virus, being killed by the common cold in the end, that is, again, a genius bit of invention, which has affected, our thinking on, the idea that these kind of all-powerful Martians who were so impressive in their strengths, but they got brought down from a lack of exposure to the germs. and then you read a non-fiction book like Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs and Steel, which I do recommend for everybody. But you realise how many, during times of conquest, how many people die from exposure to germs that they weren't used to. So, for example, when the European settlers went into North America, a huge amount of the Native American tribes died from exposure to diseases that they hadn't come across before. And Jared Diamond goes into this in a lot of detail, and it's partly the fact that, and this, well, I hope this blows your mind because it blew my mind, but the fact that the Europeans had been living for a long time with their animals, with their livestock, and a lot of diseases that affect humans are derived from animals. And if you spend a long time living with animals, then you can build an immunity to those diseases. And in Europe, as opposed to North America, for example, there's a lot more animals that are domesticable, can be domesticated. This blew my mind because I never thought of it like that before. So it's almost, there's a link between H.G. Wells and what he wrote in The War of the Worlds, and between a non-fiction writer who came along a lot later, and he's saying here's the science behind why viruses affect people and where it comes from, and in that book it's all about why certain countries technologically advance more than others, to do with the amount of animals they could domesticate, to do with the plants that they could domesticate. That leads to then an agrarian culture. That leads to then specialist armies because they don't have to tend the crops all the time. And suddenly your perspective and the broadness of your understanding just goes bang. I guess to get back to Ready Player One, there you've got a really interesting speculation on where our kind of addiction to the internet is going to go, which is kind of fascinating.
Yeah.
And the guys who live in terrible situations in those stacks in Ready Player One, their escape is via the internet, or what's it called in the Oasis?
Yes.
It's called the Oasis. Yeah. So you got people spending now most of their lives in it, right?
Yeah. I can see that happening. Same with Black Mirror. All of the episodes of Black Mirror. Wow, that stuff, because it's set in the near future. That kind of stuff sets you. Whenever I've finished an episode of Black Mirror, there's always that little. It's sinister. You feel like I enjoyed that, but it's made me feel a little bit uneasy.
Well, we talked about 1984 on a previous podcast, didn't we?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And there's a lot of that sensibility, I think, in some of the Black Mirror episodes. Yeah. And I think Charlie Brooker is a genius.
Much,
I mean, that is unbelievable. What I particularly like about some of those episodes is they don't let you off at the end, do they? Like it isn't, and hey, it's all going to be okay.
Nothing's fine.
It's not going to be okay, and that leaves you with an impression when you go away, doesn't it? And you think, wow, okay, here's a speculation upon an aspect of technology, as it usually is in Black Mirror, isn't it? And in the book I talk about the danger that's around from internet pornography, for example.
Right.
Not being prudish, not saying, oh, this is a shocking thing, because I found out that one of the first photographs that they ever took was a pornographic one. So it's like, as soon as the technology came out, people...
Is that true,
yeah. Some of the most early photographs, as soon as people thought, hey, we can capture an image, instantly they thought, nakedness.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and of course, pornography drove the video, the VHS, the whole home video thing was driven largely by pornography. So I'm not saying the thing is bad, but what I am looking at is, as a speculative idea which was kicked off by things like science fiction and where it goes, Black Mirror and all these things. It's like, if you're going to go into the realm of fantasy, in getting a instant gratification, rather than trying to do the more difficult thing, which is establish a relationship, even if it's just a sexual relationship, that's more difficult than clicking on a thing on the web, right? That's not a problem in itself, but if it becomes a replacement for the real thing, then that probably isn't going to go in a good place.
Yeah, all the data's out there on that. There's been lots of stuff on the internet I've seen about that sort of thing where...
If it goes into an addiction and it's now replacing something real, then, in speculative fiction, in science fiction, you can kind of run a thought experiment and say, well, where is this likely to go? And again, it's not saying that that's the final answer. I think all that science fiction, speculative fiction is trying to do is just get you thinking, running along those rails, and doing a thought experiment about where it's going to go.
Is there any examples or instances in life where science fiction or reading science fiction or this kind of what we're talking about now has helped you, or it's kind of opened your mind to stuff? Or
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to go right back to 2001, the Stanley Kubrick film, which was written partly by him, partly with Arthur C. Clarke. They wrote I think I'm right in saying they wrote the novel, or he wrote the novel simultaneously as they were making the film.
Right, okay.
And right from an early age, I mean, you think about an awareness of things beyond our own sphere, as in as human beings, just beyond our immediate experience of being on Earth. And he's I know a lot of people kind of talk about the end of 2001 and what the hell was it all about and everything. I've got my own interpretation of that, which changes over time. But if you read it together with the novel as well, it seems it was quite clear that he was trying to take you in a place where you considered beyond your immediate environment and into other forces in the universe which may have an influence on us and on the evolution of the human race. You have the baby at the end, which seems, well, to me, it seems like the next evolution in humanity, from the exposure to the monolith, which is like an alien intelligence.
Right.
So that's like just an example that kind of got me thinking, early doors or early enough. It's like planting a seed of considering things which are beyond your immediate experience.
And do you think this is applicable to everyone? So you're saying creative people, this would be helpful for, but do you think this is the kind of thing that you can use in any sphere of life, from business to creative stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things which we'll probably do a podcast on Edward de Bono because he deserves one on his own. But Edward de Bono, who first coined the term lateral thinking, and he talks about how you expose yourself to different influences.
Yeah.
In order to change your perspective and come up with new ideas. Right. And he could have been saying that about science fiction and about the effect that it can have on you in considering things. Yeah. And there's so many good works. One of the things which somebody asked me recently about being an army officer was somebody who was going to Sandhurst to train to be an army officer was, what books do you recommend? And I thought and it's an interesting question because there is a recommended reading while you're there. And one of the things which people think they should read is Sun Tzu's Art of War. Right. Which, in my opinion, is a waste of time for a young, somebody who's going to be a platoon commander, because it's a book that was written for generals, in the time of Sun Tzu. Yeah. And really, maybe you read that later in your army career, I don't know, but you don't need.
It's a bit heavy, right?
You don't need that level of it.
Yeah.
And what I said was, actually, I think you're better off reading Starship Troopers by Robert Heinlein.
Serious, right?
Yeah, because in that book, as opposed to the Paul Verhoeven film, which is a completely different take on it, but in the book, when you've got Johnny Rico, he goes up through the ranks and he becomes a platoon commander. But in that book, his relationship, I know it's not set in space, of course it is. It's set with these incredible suits that they wear, and there's all those kind of fun things in it which make it enjoyable to read. But the relationship that he has with his platoon sergeant, for me, is more accurate and more of an interesting portrayal and something to think about for a platoon commander than reading Sun Tzu's Art of War.
Wow, I can't believe there's recommended reading. I didn't know that was a thing.
Well, one of the things which is really interesting is that the US Marines, on their website, they have a recommended reading, and Ender's Game is in it.
Yeah, right.
Ender's Game is one of their recommendations.
Yeah.
Orson Scott Card. Have you read that? Have you Ender's Game?
No, I've not read it. I've seen the movie.
But the tactical games that they play and the relationships that Ender has as he tries to make his way and assert his kind of authority, and he does it by competence and setting an example. Again, that is a good book to read if you're going to be a young platoon commander. And I'm kind of delighted that the Americans have not thought of it as being it's science fiction, and do you know what I mean? They don't seem to often have those same reservations that maybe we do sometimes with it's not proper work, or it's like no, this could be quite useful as is Starship Troopers.
So the books are more about the social kind of the social aspect and kind of people management rather than battle. And I kind of think it's more of a kind of a thinking man sort of approach to it.
Yeah, I mean it's about the battles as well.
Yeah.
And actually, I just remembered something funny. But in the book, in Ender's Game book, Do you remember? Or in the book, the enemies are called the buggers.
Right.
Right, and what did they call them in the film? But they didn't call them the buggers, did they?
No.
But that's what they're called in there in the book, which is cool. But yeah, it's about space as well. But by putting these kind of familiar dynamics in a speculative setting, it does give you a new perspective on. It gives them perhaps a more raw perspective.
Right.
Enables you to view them from somebody else's eyes, and that's, I think, very useful because you step outside of the familiarity, whilst it's still not being so unfamiliar that you can't empathise with the characters, which you need to in any work of entertainment. You need to feel invested in it somehow.
Is this a common thing that this thought of science fiction and innovation being connected? Because I've never known that before, or I wasn't aware of it before I read the book.
Yeah,
that was new to me. So is this a new thing that's generally kind of thought of or put out there, or is this something that you've just kind of cottoned onto and gone, you know what?
No, I think it's always been the case. If you take off your kind of, your prejudice, if that's what you've got against, for instance, science fiction, because we've always been very, in this country, a bit sneering about it. Okay. Oh, it's not proper literature. Okay. Like somehow Jane Austen is, right. By itself, And for me, that's never been the case. I mean, if you look back at some of the earlier works of science fiction, we mentioned H.G. Wells, Jules Verne before that. It's been going on a long time. You can argue that there's elements of it in Shakespeare with A Midsummer Night's Dream, and that kind of fantasy element as being a work of speculative fiction.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So, and you can even look at go into the myths and legends and see the fantastical elements in them, which should get you thinking about various, moral, conundrums, relationship things, all that sorts of stuff. So I think storytelling has always been a very useful way of setting off innovation. Yeah.
So if I'm going to go away and pick up a couple of books to read, or everyone that's watching is going to go away and pick up a couple of books to read that will be useful and helpful, what would you immediately recommend?
Well, we'd both recommend Ready Player One, wouldn't we?
I would.
Yeah.
You're much more well-read.
No, I would as well. I mean, one of the other things that I recommend very much, we talked about Starship Troopers, but there's other books as well which I think are very useful. We mentioned Ender's Game. There's a book by Joe Haldeman called The Forever War.
Okay.
He's a Vietnam veteran, right. And there's a kind of heartbreaking part of that book where, and this is kind of what I'm talking about, how you change your perspective. The protagonist in that has his girlfriend. They're both in the army, but obviously it's a galactic thing, and they both get posted separately. Yeah. But because of relativity in space, they know instantly that they'll never see each other again, even though they're both only gone for 4 months. Because by the time that they would get back together, one of them would have died because of the time that it takes, and that's heartbreaking. It's a kind of an amazing way of conveying what it feels like to be gone a long time in war, and then everything's changed when you get back. And I wonder, because he was a Vietnam veteran, he felt that kind of sense of displacement when he came back. He's experienced all these things, which other people back home haven't. You, as a soldier, you go back and you think everything's going to be the same as when you left, but of course people have moved on. My mother told me really interesting stories about the Second World War and people coming back thinking it was going to be the same. But those, for instance, maybe the women at home had become very independent in that time, and they had moved on a bit in their mind. So for the man coming back, my grandfather was away for 6 years. He was away as long as anybody because he was in the Territorial Army, so he was called up first. Right. But he was away for a long time, and you go back and then you expect it to be the same, but you've changed as people. And he runs with that, Joe Haldeman, and you get this incredible scene where they realise that that's going to be how it plays out. It's a heartbreaking. Yeah. It's a heartbreaking thing.
Interstellar. It's a bit like you've seen Interstellar.
Yeah. Well, they have that relativity in space.
Exactly. Where they go away for
that's
a
brilliant,
couple of hours, and he comes back and he watches his kid's life for the last 20 odd years.
I'm getting like goosebumps thinking about that.
It's harrowing to watch in a way. It's a good film though. Tough bit of stuff to watch.
Yeah, it's that's the thing about it. It can make you change the perspective on how you're seeing things through a fantastical lens. Other books that I would recommend. So we got Starship Troopers, haven't we? Which is great. There's other things that are really interesting, like I Am Legend, a Richard Matheson book.
Right.
which I think is a very important one.
That's the Will Smith movie, right?
But not to be a bore and talk about books great and films rubbish, because it's a different medium. But in most of the dramatised versions of it, they kind of miss the central point. And the central point is, if you're the only human left on Earth and everybody else is a vampire, are you then the one who's out of order with everybody else? Are you now the boogeyman? And he's the boogeyman for the vampires, because during the daytime he goes around and kills them in their sleep. Men, women, and children. Right. All right, they're vampires, but he becomes the monster.
I see. That's portrayed totally differently.
Yeah,
wow.
But that's the whole point of the title of I Am Legend, is because he's a legend amongst the vampires for being the boogeyman, for being a monster.
So they're a bit more kind of, aware, switched on.
Yeah. So I should have explained that. Yeah, in the book they are conscious, intelligent, because they were human, they're now vampires, but they retain their intelligence. And he's a very flawed character because he spends most of the time getting drunk when he's not killing vampires in their homes. And his loneliness is a central theme of the book. And they try and taunt him to come out of his fortified house. And they taunt him by getting the females to sort of strip off in front of the house, and because he's so lonely and he still has a man's desires, but he's the only human left. It's a lot, and it's quite a short book, but it's very, very powerful.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah. So that would be another one. There's so many when you get into it which will really blow your mind. Like Olaf Stapleton, the Star Maker, is just talk about changing your perspective to a cosmic one rather than a just a simple earthbound one. Yeah. I mean, he was a philosophy professor in Liverpool. Okay. And there's in the philosophy department there, which obviously I spent some time in. Yeah. There's I think there's a picture of him up, and him and Clive Barker, the horror writer. Okay. Who really interesting stuff as well.
I've never heard of those dudes.
Really?
What's all that about? Olaf Stapleton. When's he from? When was he around? Was he?
Is he? Somebody will correct me on this, but I think he's like 40s.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. Yeah. He's an earlier one. Right. Yeah, and his stuff is mind blowing because of its perspective. But the Star Maker is definitely one which will really kick off some stuff in your head. But even if you think about how important in culture the Matrix is, it's referenced all the time, isn't it?
Yeah. Red pill, blue pill, all that.
Right. So that's taken on a new meaning, hasn't it? Mm-hmm. The idea of being red pilled is now a phrase that people use, don't they? Yeah. Which all comes from back then. Yeah. So they can become part of common speech, but there's a whole host of other things which, when you get into them and you start looking at the really good guys, the really good writers, and by good writers I mean those people who have the ability to blow your mind on it. Yeah. You come across some strange things, like if you read science fiction from the 50s, sometimes they're knocking around in like air cars, like hover cars, right. But then they have to stop to make a phone call at a phone booth. And it's like, but there's limits on your ability to predict the future. Yeah. And obviously, I think that's in a Philip K. Dick one I'm thinking about, who's another writer which I absolutely love. But yeah, he has them in hover cars, and then I need to stop to make a phone call. I need to get in a payphone.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
that's good. I like that.
Yeah, but I mean, what kind of stuff have you? You obviously watched a lot of science fiction films, haven't you?
Yeah, I watched my fair share of sci-fi films, but I'm just not well read with books. I've got to be completely gripped by a book from the outset because it's such a big investment of time. If it's boring me, I'll kind of give up on it, which is why I like Ready Player One so much, because that just completely gripped me from the start. I thought it was brilliant. But yeah, movies, yeah. Books, not so much.
But you can, I mean, a lot of these same sort of benefits you can get from movies. There's nothing kind of, what's the word, like sanctified about about books necessarily.
But I can see how reading a book would because you do spend more time on it, suppose, and you are more invested in it, and you are creating a kind of the landscapes in your own mind about what's going on and stuff, and you're not as perhaps as guided as you are in a movie, because a movie's a lot shorter. They've got to condense everything down. So perhaps reading the book would open your mind a lot more, because you're spending a lot more time learning about the characters, I suppose. You can see how that would.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things of these kind of innovations and crazy ideas that you can't necessarily capture in a film. It's been really interesting to me seeing Netflix and the series develop as a kind of an alternative, because you've got so much more time to tell the story.
Yeah, right.
Having in a series of whatever. I mean, one of the things again that I'd recommend for anybody is Dune, the Frank Herbert Herbert series.
Yeah, right.
And in particular, when you get to God Emperor of Dune, the story is crazy. Like it's about the ruler of Dune is a half man, half worm hybrid.
Okay.
The sandworms in Dune. He's becoming one of them, and you think, what on earth is going on? But within that book, there's as much intelligent political comment and military, because Frank Herbert, I think, was in the Navy.
Okay.
But his intelligence in understanding how politics works and how military things work in that is absolutely brilliant.
I didn't realise that was a series of books.
Yeah.
That'd be a good one to watch on the old Netflix, right?
Oh well, it's a series of books, but there isn't. Yeah, I think there's a mini series of some of the stuff that's been done.
Okay.
And obviously there's the David Lynch film, I think it is. But again, he's trying to attempt to do this incredible, like, galactic spanning story in a film is difficult. And there's still parts of that film that I really like.
Yeah.
With Carl McLachlan and Patrick Stewart's in it as well.
Yeah.
Sean Young.
Sting in it.
Sting's in it.
Yeah,
Sting's good in it.
Years ago, I've not seen it for ages, but
Sting's really good in it, I think.
right.
So you get some of the aspects in there, but it's a tall order when you're talking about something which is that dense.
Yeah.
Although I think it's quite an easy book to read, really. But the intrigue in it is astonishing.
Yeah.
And he's another writer which seems to have like 500 amazing ideas before breakfast sort of thing, and you get hit with them in the book, and you're like, almost, where is this creativity coming from?
Yeah, right.
It shouldn't surprise us that writers are a bit weird, a lot of them. I'm looking at that saying, well, you're a writer, okay, yeah. But especially the kind of creative guys, they can be a bit weird, because imagine where their mind is most of the time.
Yeah.
It's like, if they're a bit eccentric, I can think we can maybe sort of forgive them of that. Thinking of eccentrics just for a second, maybe think of Alan Moore.
Okay.
So Alan Moore, now we're talking about graphic novels.
Right.
But he wrote The Watchmen, From Hell, which is about Jack the Ripper. Yeah, V for Vendetta.
Yeah.
Yeah. So and Batman: The Killing Joke, and just kind of really interesting takes on things. So, I wouldn't be sniffy at all about the graphic novel genre. To me, it's just another way of telling a story.
Yeah.
And if a story has merit, then it has merit in whatever medium that you can see it in. And if it creates, have you seen The Watchmen?
I've seen Watchmen.
As in the
yeah. I haven't seen The Watchmen. I don't think I have.
Watchmen, like the kind of like past it superheroes. Yeah, but you haven't necessarily read the graphic novel.
But no, I'm not.
Yeah. Yeah, but graphic novels are quite sort of fast to read as well.
Yeah.
Mind you, From Hell is a pretty thick tome, but he gets ideas in that about Freemasonry and the Hawksmoor churches. The Hawksmoor churches in London.
No.
So when like the Great Fire of London gutted a lot of London.
Yeah.
And people like Christopher Wren and Hawksmoor, they kind of rebuilt part of it, and he was given the job of doing a lot of the churches, and it's kind of well documented. But he created them, and they make the lines of a pentagram.
Okay.
With St Paul's Cathedral, which Christopher Wren did, right in the middle.
Right.
And again, this is something to get you ticking on ideas. I've seen it in documentaries. The idea that what they were doing was, because it's a pentagram is a magical symbol, but the interesting thing is, if you're interested in that sort of thing, traditionally the pentagram denotes a ritual space, and it's a method of protecting that ritual space against evil outside influences or negative outside influences. So it could well be, because these guys were not only super intelligent, but they were really plugged into architecture at the deepest level.
Right.
And the Hawksmoor churches some of them look like ziggurats. They look like sort of Babylonian and the huge Egyptian influence. I don't think that's up for debate really. I mean, they bring in lots of different influences, so it may well be that they did that consciously, or not, but it may well be because these guys were as architects very plugged into Freemasonry and where those ideas come to get heavily influenced by Egypt.
Yeah.
But this is the point. This is where it takes you.
Yeah.
And if you've got a curiosity about how things work, then you can go down those routes. And this for me is the best. But you get entertained as well. I mean, it's interesting stuff. It's not interesting stuff for everybody. I appreciate that, but I think if you get into it, you will find something which is right for you. Okay. And whether it's looking at a movie, whether it's looking at the literature, the graphic novel, whatever it is, there'll be something in it for you, even if you don't think that science fiction is one of your things, or it's just for nerds. Which I mean, I don't know what that means really, but maybe there is a difference, and maybe there is a difference between people who are just sort of into Star Trek, not to disrespect Star Trek in any way, because there was a number of interesting things that it brought up. But the type of people I mean, like
Trekkie dudes.
Yeah, but they get kind of involved in it, not from necessarily just the delight in the interesting ideas, but they kind of become like a community.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And maybe that's true for some Star Wars guys as well. Again, I mean, what did you think the first time you saw Star Wars? I don't know.
I was a youth.
A youth.
I can't remember the first time I watched Star Wars, but it was a while ago.
And you would have been too young to see it, obviously, first time round, wouldn't you?
75.
Yeah, so
when did it come out? Is it
77.
77.
First one came out, yeah.
I remember Return of the Jedi more.
Yeah, me too.
I was kind of old enough then to understand it, and I got all of the little books you could get at the club at school.
I went with my father when I can't remember how old I was. I must have been like, well, you can probably work it out based on when it came out. But I went with my father to see a back-to-back showing of all the original three in a cinema in Carlisle, which I don't think is there anymore. Right. And we sat there for whatever it was, 5-6 hours.
Transfixed, enjoying it.
No, absolutely. I mean, I remember being a bit tired towards the end, but then I wasn't very old.
It's a marathon that when you're a kid, right? That's a lot of popcorn to go through.
Yeah. But again, that kind of delight in new ideas, and I guess in mythology, I guess it all kind of comes down to that, because there's a big influence on Star Wars from Joseph Campbell.
Right.
And Joseph Campbell, who did so much work on like comparative mythology, and he and George Lucas, were friends, and he talked a lot about how the mythological tales are represented in Star Wars.
Right.
The battle between different forces and all the rest of it. So again, that's another way that a piece of popular culture can open up those ideas, because often behind something in popular culture there's actually a very deep significance, which we do at our detriment if we dismiss it for that kind of reason, like it's popular or because a lot of other people like it. Yeah. Which doesn't mean that you got to go off and read a Jane Austen novel because it seems like proper literature.
Right.
That's there's a lot of good things that you can find in there. Just, dip your toe in, find something you like, and maybe it can set off some creative expression.
Good stuff.